I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands, seas and waterways on which all of us here today live and work. For me, that's the Muwinina people of Nipaluna. And I pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Taking a moment as well just to acknowledge the contributions of First Peoples in caring for country over millennia and those that are continuing to do so all around the country today. So if you haven't joined us for a Climate Matters webinar, now's your last chance. This series has been all about ESCC Hub researchers showcasing their research highlights from the Hub to staff, researchers and our key stakeholders. And we really like to just share our science findings and discuss linkages and future opportunities. So today's webinar will discuss natural habitats for coastal protection and carbon sequestration. Our presenter is Dr. Stephen Swearer, who is Director of the National Centre for Coasts and Climate at the University of Melbourne. And Stephen led Hub Project 5.9 on this very topic. So over to you, Stephen. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Sophie. And can everybody hear me? Is this loud enough? Great. And you can see the slides? Excellent. And it's good to see future and past directors in the climate science space joining today. Hi, Simon. Hi, David. It's a real pleasure to be here on the, I'm the last, deliverable on March 31st for the Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub. So nothing like, last in, what's that, best dressed? Excellent. But I do want to also just really, give a big thank you to the Hub and to the Hub leadership team and to CSIRO in particular for this journey that we've been on and letting the NCCC get established with Hub funding. And I hope our journey, which will be continuing through the NESP2 Marine and Coastal Hub, will provide opportunities hopefully for collaboration with the Climate Science Hub. So I look forward to further conversations with all of the climate scientists that I've met over the last several years. So I'm going to be talking about challenges, highlights, and impacts on three themes. I'm going to be talking about this in the context of developing a standard method or protocol for assessing changes in sediment, organic carbon, and vegetated coastal ecosystems. I'm going to be then talking about testing the effectiveness of hybrid living shoreline approaches for habitat restoration and coastal protection. And then I will conclude with kind of the main topic, if you like, of this, but it's certainly the biggest output for this particular project, has been the publishing of an Australian guide to nature-based methods for reducing risks from coastal hazards. So in relation to blue carbon, as I'm sure many of you know, vegetated coastal ecosystems have been touted as contributing significantly to climate mitigation because of its capacity to sequester and store large quantities of carbon. These sources of carbon or stores of carbon are primarily not in above ground biomass, but in below ground in the sediments. This creates, while there's huge potential, there's some big challenges. And part of this is that we just don't really have standard and consistent methodology for quantifying carbon stocks and therefore being able to generate reliable estimates of carbon sequestration rates over time. And this then raises some uncertainty about the reliability of what our current estimates of global inventories in these particular habitats are. So the approach we took in this particular project really kind of involved two main things. One was really of reviewing and evaluating the methodologies that have been used in these global carbon inventories, and we focused primarily on mangrove ecosystem data sets. And then we wanted to then take that information to provide guidance as to what is the most appropriate method for actually quantifying sediment organic carbon in these habitats, and then to apply that methodology or best approach to assessing the magnitude of sampling required in these systems to come up with a reliable estimate of what that stock might be. And this was a study we did at very high spatial resolution in a mangrove forest in Western Port Bay in Victoria. And that's what this diagram represents here of that kind of gridded sampling design. So some of the highlights that I want to just emphasize using a couple examples. So this is an example of the sorts of biases you get based on the methodology that you use in terms of coring. For anyone who's actually collected cores will know that this is nothing new, that you have a range of challenges that have to do with the level of already kind of compaction of the sediment or the soil that you're sampling. And depending on how loose that sediment is, you can get a high degree of what are called sort of issues around compression of that 1 meter core that you might be trying to take, or plugging, where you're actually losing part of that core. What we've illustrated in this figure then to the right is what would actually happen to your estimates of what the soil organic carbon content of a particular core might be if you haven't properly corrected, in this case, for the problem of compression. What are illustrated in these three panels are actually three real carbon density profile plots collected from a study in Moreton Bay in Queensland. And what we've done here is the reconstructed carbon density profile is in the solid line. And what we have are three scenarios of compaction, either 10%, 17%, or 23% compaction that could have occurred. And if it wasn't corrected for, what level of overestimation in this case you might achieve. Within these, they range in anywhere from about only a few percent, so I think it's around 10 to 12%, up to close to 50% of an overestimate, potentially simply due to not appropriately correcting for this particular sampling bias. So it just illustrates some of the challenges of sampling in these environments if you're actually using cores that are leading to sampling methodological issues that are not being properly corrected. When you apply we use Russian peat, a Russian peat coring method, which minimizes some of those particular challenges in these sort of soft marine sediments. What we see here in this figure on the right is effectively kind of a heat map of four components across that gridded sampling. In the upper left-hand corner, this is actually the sediment organic carbon, and then other sources of what could be contributing to that carbon, primarily from either the fine or dead or necromass carbon sources, as well as the above ground distribution of those mangrove plants. And what you can see is there's actually a lot of spatial heterogeneity. And there's sort of two key points. So if you actually want to, in terms of carbon accounting methodologies, in this particular mangrove system, if you wanted to be 90% confident of being within 10% of the true SOC value for this system, you'd have to actually take 43 cores. Now, 43 cores is a very large number when, if you actually look at most of these global carbon inventories and blue carbon ecosystems, they're usually based on maybe one at a maximum of about 3 cores. So they actually are sampling and making a large, basically a very large assumption that the distribution of SOC is spatially homogeneous. The other important take-home message is that you can't predict the soil or sediment organic carbon from the distribution of above ground biomass. So if you were to compare the kind of heat map, if you like, in the upper left-hand corner to the red plot in the lower right-hand corner, you can see the hot spots and where the trees are is actually not the hot spot where the SOC values are highest. And so using that above ground biomass, from aerial imagery, for example, to predict what's in the sediment is actually going to be very difficult, at least in a system like this. So what does this mean in terms of blue carbon systems? Well, I think what we've achieved from this work is an improved understanding of the high degree of fine-scale spatial variability in carbon stocks in coastal vegetated ecosystems. We've delivered better recommendations for how we can better monitor changes in sediment carbon stocks in these ecosystems. So the issue here then is if we want to actually get credit for sediment organic carbon in terms of carbon accounting, then we actually need better methods to properly quantify this. And if you actually look at what's happening now at a federal level in terms of developing potentially an emission reduction fund method related to blue carbon ecosystems, the method that's currently being developed is about retidally inundating coastal wetlands. And actually there's a very almost non-existent or negligible amount of credit that you can even get from the carbon, from the sediment pool. And this is because we just don't have a method to reliably measure it accurately. And so it's a conservative method at this point. So I I think what's valuable then is that we're actually then applying these methods to assess changes in sediment carbon in response to a range of coastal land management practices. In this case, in the work that we've been involved in, it's been around hybrid living shoreline projects that we've been implementing in Victoria and in New South Wales, or working with people who have been doing these on-ground projects. So that's a segue into the second theme here of hybrid living shorelines. And what are the challenges around this is we tend to defend coastlines using hard engineering solutions. And the challenges with these is that they're non-adaptive, they're typically very expensive, and they also actually lead to environmental impact. So they actually don't, they actually typically have bad outcomes for marine and coastal biodiversity. When we lose natural habitats, that loss can actually lead to environmental conditions that change, making them actually very unsuitable to actually reestablish these habitats. So in an example here on this figure on the right, where we're trying to reestablish mangroves in a mudflat, is that we have situations where the loss of sediment trapping and wave attenuation from mature stands actually changes sediment grain size and sediment biochemistry, and leads to a wave energy environment that actually makes it very difficult for seedlings to establish and survive. So the advantage of potentially opportunity here around hybrid solutions is that can actually assist at mitigating or modifying those environments to make them more suitable for actually reestablishing these natural ecosystems. And the advantage then is by integrating a soft coastal protection solution with a hard one, is that we also get a range of other ecosystem service co-benefits that we don't get from an entirely hard engineering solution. The approach we've taken in this component of Project 5.9 has been to assess the co-benefits of existing hybrid living shoreline projects. That we were lucky to take advantages of the rather extensive rock revetment projects that have happened in the central New South Wales coast, that range from fairly recent to systems that have been established over 20 years ago. So there's a reasonable good chronosequence within those systems. And then we've also been establishing some new hybrid coastal protection projects here in Victoria, and that's allowed us to actually then assess the potential advantages of this coastal armoring to restore mangroves in areas where they've been lost. So some of the highlights of this project have been, this is just a profile documenting that these rock revetments are achieving their endpoint, which is to stop coastal erosion in these estuaries. What we have here are 3 profiles of bank elevation from the landward to the seaward side, moving from left to right on that figure. What you have in the eroding bank is the sort of darker orange, which is the one that shows the greater steep bank profile. And you have a much more shallow and gradual profile, and actually you see evidence of increase in elevation associated with the rock revetment itself, which is where that blue vertical line is. So what these systems do is they stabilize these banks, and that actually leads to good outcomes for regeneration of mangrove habitat. So what we see in this plot are these 2 panels over here on the right. The one on the left, or panel A, is looking at the change in above ground biomass, so that's delta AGB, and as a function of age of these rock revetments. The relationship in the gray circles is the relationship between a natural mangrove stand relative to the rock revetment relative to, no, it is, I'm sorry, I had the correct way, the natural mangroves relative to the rock revetment. And what you can see is that over about a 17-year time period, the rock revetments have effectively achieved a similar above ground biomass as natural mangroves. And what you see is that there's relative to an eroding bank, they both start with very little above ground biomass. And what you see is that there's above ground biomass in eroding banks is getting progressively worse and worse compared to what you're achieving in terms of regeneration in these rock revetments. You see a slightly different relationship when you look at changes in the density of mangrove trees within these stands. Again, you see much greater declines relative to the eroding banks because these trees are not able to establish and grow. But you're also seeing a higher densities in the rock revetments relative to natural mangrove stands. And this is simply a reflection of the fact that this is a recovering forest, and we're seeing high densities of small adults, and we haven't seen the natural process of thinning that happens when trees get much bigger and start overtopping and overshading smaller individuals. So we're still in this sort of successional stage of mangrove forest development. But the upshot is that we're getting good recovery of these systems by stabilizing these banks with the provision of these revetments. In terms of more recent projects that we've been involved in, we've been working with the Victorian government and local councils, as well as the Reef Design Lab, to actually engineer a variety of different types of mangrove pods or structures in which effectively kind of planters that we put out in shallow subtidal areas to provide an immediate coastal protection benefit offshore of eroding banks, to then explore experimentally whether the distribution or the provisioning of this protective structures actually increase survival of seedlings and seeds of mangroves that are planted within these arrays. And these are just two different designs. This is the wasted planter design on the left and these hexagon planter designs on the right. And I'm going to show you data on early survival for two locations we've done in Western Port Bay and in Western Port Bay and Victoria. So this is a site in Granville, which is a more benign environment. So the wave energy in this area is not as great. It is an area too where other citizen science groups have been successful in reestablishing mangroves. And what you can see in this plot then is a comparison of basically survival rates over the first 9 months of planting in these different planters, either inside the planter, adjacent to the planter, or controls that are away from the array. And what you see with this is we didn't know what was going to happen with these designs. This is an example of where our intended protection actually failed. So these wasted planters actually resulted in significantly lower survival of mangroves. And what ended up happening is that the sediments here are fine enough that we were trapping water inside the wasted planter. It wasn't sufficiently draining with this initial prototype design, and these plants were effectively drowning. They weren't having any experience of time with less saturated sediments. This is in contrast to a more energetic environment. This is Lang Lang. This is further in the northeast corner, which experiences a much larger wave fetch. This is an area that's chronically been eroding, and there's been 20 years of failed mangrove restoration projects. And interestingly here, we are getting higher survival rates initially so far, at least for mangroves that have been protected in these planters relative to ones that are adjacent, or even relative to the controls, although at least statistically we're not seeing that yet in the data. So it suggests that you're going to have very context-specific outcomes of some of this protection, where hybrid approaches are likely to be much more successful than non-hybrid approaches, particularly in areas where wave energy is a limiting factor in influencing recolonization and regeneration of this particular habitat. So impacts from this component of the project have been, certainly from the work in New South Wales, I was able to present everything. We've looked at a range of other ecosystem service benefits, such as around initial quantifications of what the blue carbon benefits of rock revetments are relative to eroding banks and natural mangrove stands, as well as impacts on biodiversity. But we do have a much better understanding then of what the broader environmental benefits of hybrid living shorelines might be in this particular system. We've also established the first shellfish as well as mangrove hybrid living shoreline projects in Victoria, and they then provide a great baseline for ongoing monitoring and evaluation to look at the broader environmental responses of these management interventions, particularly in relation to more historical coastal protection projects that have been typically installed, not just in Victoria, but around Australia in general. And I think also really importantly, and this has been true from our interactions with local government agencies, is that having these demonstration locations or on-ground actions have greatly increased interest and potential uptake by coastal council. So I think it's one of those examples of where nobody wants to take the leap first, but once someone commits and you get some good demonstration sites in, people see the real benefit, as well as seeing how the community has responded to these installations and to become less risk averse about potentially trialing these innovative and non-traditional approaches. So the third component of my presentation then is to talk and fill you in a little bit more about what these national guidelines are. And so what the challenge that we initially, this was aimed at tackling is that, as you look at this plot here, is that living shoreline research and its application happens overseas. There's very little that's actually been done in Australia. It's largely being driven out of research and application in North America, primarily in the United States, with a bit of activity in Europe, particularly in the Netherlands. What this means then also is that we don't have guidelines, even though there are about 3 out there nationally. There's one that's driven a fair amount of development in the US, another one from the Netherlands, and then there's a more general one that's from an international engineering organization. But we just don't have guidelines that are actually specific to an Australian context, so specific to the natural coastal ecosystems that we have and the hazard climate that we also have. And so this lack of information on the suitability of different approaches is, from our engagement over the life of the hub, has been perceived to actually be one of the big issues hindering uptake of nature-based approaches. And so we felt getting some of this documentation together in the form of a guideline would help kickstart a culture change in how we manage coastal marine environments. So our approach then was to wrangle a lot of researchers across Australia with expertise in different marine and coastal habitats that provide coastal hazard risk reduction benefits, as well as coastal engineers, social scientists, and economists to put this document together. So I'm going to, in the interest of time, going to give just a really broad overview of the structure and what each of the different sections has, but I'm more than happy to take questions in the Q&A session, and I'm also more than happy to give you a copy of this guide, which is very close to being finalized, and we're actually at a stage now where we're getting a lot of end-user evaluation of this document and making changes to it. And we also have a long-term plan that this will be a living document, so even though this is version 1, there will be many more versions of this based on subsequent input. So certainly happy to take on board any suggestions for improvement from the audience. So section 1 of this guideline outlines how nature-based methods work, the benefits and co-benefits they provide, and their broader considerations for their use. And so this is an example of some of the ways in which they can be important. So attenuating waves due to the roughness, wave attenuation due to changes in the depth, and also erosion mitigation within these ecosystems as well. Section 2 details the ecological and engineering requirements that each habitat that can be applied as a nature-based method. So we have sections on beach renourishment, vegetated dunes, salt marsh, seagrass, shellfish reefs, coral reefs, kelp forests or macroalgae, and mangroves. Section 3 provides a framework for how you would go about implementing a nature-based coastal defense project in your local area. And it's structured around the processes of what you need to think about in terms of initiation, planning and design, construction, and ongoing operation and maintenance. Section 4 of the guideline actually provides a framework for actually conducting benefit cost analysis to evaluate different methods. So this is often a big driver for what should I do, not just what might be suitable, but they're also going to be economic drivers. And so there's a whole series of steps that have been outlined about how you would go about doing that for your specific project that relate to how you define the project, identifying the biophysical impacts that you're trying to mitigate, valuing those impacts, issues around discounting, related particularly around the services that they might provide, decision metrics that you should consider, and then ultimately a sensitivity analysis on that decision. Section 5, some of you might have actually participated in this. We had a social scientist interview key stakeholders in most states to get an understanding of the policy framework and landscape for the implementation of nature-based coastal defense, with the focus really being to try to understand what the kind of enablers and potential, I guess, roadblocks might be for a nature-based coastal defense adoption. So the focus in New South Wales and Victoria was really around their interest around nature-based methods. In Queensland and South Australia, it's what they call soft solutions. In WA, there's a fair amount of activity around beach nourishment and artificial reef deployment. And we didn't include, well, we struggled to get people to engage with us from the NT and Tasmania, at least as part of this first analysis. And this table just shows just kind of what that legislative and policy and strategic guideline structure is within those different jurisdictions. So what is the impact of this guideline? So we're hoping that it's going to improve understanding of what nature-based methods for coastal protection are, and more importantly, where it might be appropriate to consider that as an option moving forward. If there is interest, then it provides it really kind of a roadmap, if you like, or guidance for what steps are required in implementing a nature-based solution. And hopefully this will lead to greater consideration of nature-based methods in government policy and strategic thinking. So next steps. From a blue carbon perspective, I think there really is a strong need for consensus around methodology and the application of that methodology so that we can get much more accurate and precise and reliable estimates of what not just Australia's blue carbon inventory is, but to get a better understanding of what role these ecosystems play globally in carbon cycling. In terms of hybrid living shorelines, we've got a lot of demonstrations and test case studies, if you like, in the ocean or onshore, if you like, but it's early days. And we know that it's going to take a long time to be able to fully understand what impacts these structures have as a coastal protection strategy. And so the next steps really are to continue with monitoring and evaluation so that we can document the timelines over which you're going to get a coastal protection benefit and the magnitude that benefit, I guess effectively, what's the magnitude of the benefit that you've achieved over that time frame. In terms of the national guidelines, it's really around uptake and implementation. And so we're part of the process we're in now is trying to get a better understanding of what uptake pathways we should be considering to increase the likelihood that it's going to get used. We don't want to simply generate a document that's going to be a great Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub output that's going to collect dust on, virtually at least on someone's computer and actually not be a fit for purpose or a useful document because it potentially hasn't actually been appropriately incorporated within government policy relevant to stakeholders who might be wanting to implement a nature-based approach. So that's it for me. I'm happy to take any questions you have, and I guess just to give you a little bit of update on where the National Center for Coast and Climate is. We are potentially months away of finalizing a home at the Point Nepean Quarantine Station. We're at the pointy end of those negotiations, but we were lucky enough to get federal grant funding for the infrastructure, and now it's just in negotiations about what we can build for 25 million and whether we can get the sign off from the relevant Victorian government bodies to approve it. But it's possible that in 2024, we might be holding a workshop around nature-based methods to solve climate challenges in 2024 at Point Nepean. So I hope that's my wish that we might be able to achieve that. And maybe we could even have a live webinar there all together. That would be great. Anyway, so thanks for your time and thanks for listening.